Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to an evidence session of the International Agreements Committee on the UK-India Free Trade Agreement. This is the first of 6 such inquiry sessions. The meeting is being broadcast live via the parliamentary website. A transcript of the meeting will be taken and published on the committee website. You will have an opportunity to make corrections to that transcript wherever necessary. I thank both our evidence givers today, and perhaps if they can introduce themselves when they answer the first question, which I'm going to ask. So what is your assessment of the final terms of the UK-India Free Trade Agreement? And to what extent do you think the UK government has achieved its objectives that it set out in its strategic approach document? And perhaps, Sophie Hale, if you can answer that, have first go on
that. Hi, thank you for inviting me. My name is Sophie Hale. I'm a principal economist working on trade at the Resolution Foundation. Looking at the FTA as a whole and sort of whether they achieved what they set out to do, we can talk a little bit about how important India is to the UK, but I guess ultimately what the UK government set out in its strategic approach document was to achieve what was essentially a sort of deep free trade agreement with kind of broad coverage. They had aims to have chapters on things like procurement and intellectual property, on environment and labour standards, which are typical of a slightly kind of deeper free trade agreement compared to kind of some of the more narrowly focused ones. In that capacity, they basically succeeded in delivering a deeper free trade agreement with India. Some of these chapters are ones that we haven't really seen in any kind of form of Indian free trade agreement before. So that is a success against those objectives. And the example would be, procurement. India is not a member of the government procurement agreement, and so even relatively even slightly less deep provisions within that chapter is still locking in or providing some kind of transparency that maybe the UK wasn't able to have before. We've also got access being locked in on various digital and intellectual property measures as well. It delivers pretty broad and extensive tariff liberalisation. It delivers a couple of kind of big wins that the UK government was looking for, with kind of notable examples on tariffs on cars and on whiskey. And we've offered broad kind of tariff liberalisation in return, but with a few key sensitive areas protected. I think the overall value is going to be really dependent on 2 things. So on the implementation and on the utilisation. On implementation, essentially where the agreement creates a lot of scope for depth is creating pathways for things like mutual recognition agreements and mutual recognition of professional qualifications in future on various sectors of where the UK and India are trading, and whether those kind of materialise ultimately will affect the kind of end value, because without those arrangements, it's not particularly deep on any one sector. And then on utilisation, one thing to flag is the rules of origin, and I'm sure there'll be a further session where there will be a lot more detail on this, but the rules of origin in the agreement, particularly in some places, and the impact assessment on the deal acknowledges this. They are stricter than in some historical agreements. And what that means is that we might see quite low utilisation rates of some of those kind of tariff preferences if the UK can't meet those if UK suppliers can't meet those rules of origin. So to refer back to the kind of strategic objectives, I guess this is maybe one of the areas where I think their strategic objective was to deliver simple rules of origin that reflect UK industry requirements and consider existing as well as future supply chains. So, whether that could be deemed as a kind of success is maybe something. Just thinking about India as a partner, I think is also important. India probably represents about 2% of UK.
We're having a bit of funniness with your sound a minute, Ms. Hale.
So trade, so partner, but yeah.
Okay, so. I mean, I think we're going to come back to quite a lot of those other issues in a moment, and hopefully your bandwidth will say. Okay. Dr. Mattia di Ubaldo, there may be something left to answer in that question, but I'm going to broaden it out in order to give you some scope, which really, in a sense, is how much does this actually affect our national interest, and really how significant does this all add up to? So if there are things you'd like to add to the point around whether or not we meet this meets the strategic approach, but also, in a sense, try to put this in a context of significance as well, please.
So hi, good afternoon. My name is Mattia di Ubaldo. I'm a principal research fellow at the University of Sussex, and I'm a deputy director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory. So I believe this is overall a fairly good and balanced deal. Perhaps not as comprehensive as some of the other recent UK FTAs that were signed post-Brexit. However, it is the biggest and I think economically the most significant deal that the UK has signed after the TCA. It can also be considered a political achievement because India is notoriously highly protected. It's hard to negotiate with. It has the highest tariffs in the G20. So it's definitely a good result. Now, in terms of trade objectives, I think both countries' objectives are complementary, right? Particularly in finance, in healthcare, and pharmaceutical. These are both global leaders. So it's a deal of mutual convenience. I think before going to the sort of detailed terms of the deal, we can also speak to the importance of having guaranteed certainty of market access. So being able to simply bind currently applied policy can be very important and can give tangible benefits going forward. In terms of economic importance, DPT's impact assessment sort of simulated about 5 billion extra GDP per year, both for the UK and India. But I think it's probably of greater economic importance for the UK, taken as a whole. Now, in terms of sort of the main gains, in terms of goods liberalization, India gains probably less than the UK because the UK's tariffs were already low to start with, and India was a beneficiary of the developing countries trading scheme. You might be aware of this sort of development-oriented policy whereby the UK offers preferential access to a number of developing countries. India currently benefits from that scheme, although it had lost access in a number of important sectors. So there's definitely also sort of market access to be gained for India. I think where the agreement comes a bit short is perhaps on services. What the deal achieved is basically giving certainty of access and fair and equal treatment to UK firms in India. There could have been perhaps more and more extensive liberalization, with more ambitious provisions on digital trade. But then, you have to consider also what the UK didn't want to concede. So we can talk about trade-offs later on, but this is probably one of the areas where more could have been done. Other things that Sophie mentioned, public procurement, IP protection, and also that's good achievements. I think by and large, the objectives were achieved. Perhaps one thing to mention is on the environment and labor chapters. The objectives were achieved, perhaps because they were low to start with. So we have to consider the partner with which the UK was negotiating this time. The chapters are less ambitious than those that UK negotiated with New Zealand, with the EU, for instance. There are no binding commitments, but it's a first for India. So if you speak to Indian negotiators or experts, they consider this to be a big win for the UK. I'll leave it at that.
Well, thanks. That's a great start, and I think we'll be circling back on quite a few of those issues. But I think if I ask my colleague Lord Hale to pick up on the questions now.
Yes, well, good afternoon. I wonder if you could, both of you, suggest in what way did the wider geopolitical context for trade, particularly in the latter part of the negotiations, influence the trajectory of the negotiations, or decisions made when a deal was struck at the end? And has, in your view, the current geopolitical context influenced the development of Indian trade policy, which in the past has been characterized by most people who negotiated with it as highly protectionist? And perhaps as a second, quite separate issue, could you address the question of whether this agreement can remain one that gives the UK genuine advantages, competitive advantages, should subsequent deals reached by India, for example, with the European Union, or perhaps with a Trump administration which has changed course, frequently does so, how would Britain's advantage be retained? Could it be retained? And if so, how could it be retained?
Perhaps if Dr. Ubaldo kicks off on this one.
Happy to go first, thank you. So I think that in the current sort of scenario of heightened economic uncertainty, security uncertainty, we all know the reasons caused by the US and Russia, and also some concerns about UK's relationship with China. And what UK is currently doing is trying to see closer relations that with big partners such as the EU, the US, resource-rich countries like China, but also growing markets like India. I think that's where India comes into play. India is currently not the main partner of the UK for critical technology or critical minerals, or it's not even the main export market. But given the shift in the geopolitical landscape, we're sort of moving away from a more normative sort of value sort of based trade policy making, and we're sort of moving towards more realist policy making, where we're trying to get the best we can get under given circumstances. So in that sort of optic, I think the UK has found a very sort of important partner in the Indo-Pacific area, a partner that can provide stability. Also because currently India does not participate in any of the sort of big regional bloc, such as CPTPP or RCEP, so the UK has privileged access to India. So I think that the current context, also thinking about Trump's tariffs, certainly sort of provided a big push to both parties to reach an agreement that can provide certainty of access. And also it was a big opportunity to provide support to the rules-based trading system, of which both UK and India are strong supporters. A possible deal with the EU on India's side clearly would undermine the UK's advantage in India, because currently, I mean, having secure preferential market access in important sectors such as cars could be diminished by India giving similar concessions to a big competitor to UK, such as the EU. I think the EU is the biggest competitor in the car industry in important markets abroad. So. I think that similar concessions could undermine the UK's advantage.
I'm sorry, the question I asked was not really so much whether an agreement that India reached with, let's say, the EU would reduce the margin of benefit to the UK, but to what extent it is possible for the UK to guard against the EU getting better terms than the UK has got.
Well, I'm not sure. So if I understand your question, I'm not sure the UK could do much in a negotiation between the EU and India. I mean, it's something I don't have a straight answer to. I'm sorry.
Perhaps, Sophie, do you have some observations on that and the rest of Lord Hale's questions?
I mean, I agree to some extent. The UK doesn't play a role in kind of the India EU negotiations. I think India has made it quite clear in some of the statements that we've had that it sees the UK deal as a template for a deal that it could pursue with the EU. I don't think that means it's necessarily looking to make considerably more concessions than it did with the UK, but of course the EU is a bigger trading partner, so there is more of an incentive if they want to secure that access. It will have the same motivations. India as a country has the same motivations it had to secure the deal with the UK as it does with the EU, which is that it wants to kind of shore up market access in Europe to protect against the current US administration's tariffs and other kind of protectionist policies. It is motivated to secure that deal with the EU. I think, as I mentioned in kind of opening, there are a number of ways that this deal can continue to become deeper. There's a number of pathways that allow sectors to look to do further liberalisation. So there are pathways created within this deal to make sure that the UK could continue deepening their liberalisation with India, both on the services side and on the goods side. So I guess the one area where that kind of deterioration could happen, relative deterioration could happen, is on the tariff market access side, and that's much less likely to get reopened. Whereas I think if we're talking more about kind of mutual recognition, more about the NTM side, the committees that have been set up should have some kind of recourse to addressing any relative deterioration if an India-EU deal is reached.
Lord Hale, does that cover? Thank you. Now turn to questions from Lord Goldsmith. I should say Lord Goldsmith is the chair of this committee, and it's only the fact that he's in a remote location that I've got this
we'd
job.
like to know where that is.
So, Lord Goldsmith.
He's on mute.
I want to, first of all, welcome you also on my own behalf to our two witnesses for coming to us today. I'm sorry I'm not with you. Well, I'm not completely sorry, because I'm actually in India at the moment, so it's entirely appropriate. I'm sitting in Delhi, but in the evening in a hotel room at the moment. So I want to ask you a general question, and then I'm going to come on something a bit more specific, and I'll make a little declaration at that point. What I want to ask you principally is to tell us what the main sectors are that, in your view, are going to benefit from the deal, and conversely, which sectors are most exposed. So if we can start with that first of all, I'll then move on to the more specific question. I don't know who wants to start. Well,
one of you jump in.
I'm happy to have a go, Sophie, if that's okay. In terms of goods trade, we know where the big tariff cuts were. It's whiskey and gin, cars, agri-food, medical equipment, cosmetics, and toiletries. These are sort of the big winners on the goods side. There's various quotas that will apply to UK export as well, for instance, in the car industry. And all the liberalization on India's side will be sort of staged, will be less deep, and also sort of less extensive than what the UK has offered. In terms of the main sector expected to grow, it's actually, I think, a positive story, because we see most UK sectors as sort of potentially growing, except the textile. So exports supposed to grow clearly in beverages, motor vehicles, some advanced manufacturing, chemicals, rubber and plastic. The competition in textiles from India will probably shrink the UK industry to some extent, although I believe a lot of the sort of increased UK imports in these industries will come at the expense of other developing countries. So the actual degree of competitive pressure on domestic producers will not be as big as one could fear.
Sophie, do you have anything to add to that, particularly on perhaps which industries are most exposed by this, if any?
Largely agree with that assessment. Textiles being the one that, as Mattia mentioned, is potentially exposed to kind of increased import competition. It definitely looks like it's going to become a lot more kind of open to competition and traded. We see big increases in both imports and exports of kind of textiles. But the sector does shrink. So, that might be driving some kind of productivity gains in that sector. So the overall reduction in GVA is maybe not as kind of negative from a kind of economy point of view as it might look if you just look at, you know, whether it's growing or shrinking. I guess the only other areas to flag, you might have mentioned chemicals. I think they have in the impact assessment, there's a reasonable growth in that sector, and obviously service sectors as well. As Mattia said, there isn't a lot of deep liberalisation, but there is locking in certainty for UK service exporters. So we could see some real growth in certain service sectors, and we could see some competition in others. So communication is the one service sector where India is particularly competitive, and I think the sector doesn't grow as much in the UK, and most service sectors are expected to grow. I mean, that's both because it's able to export more to India, and gaining from that, and also as a kind of general equilibrium, you know, the country is becoming a bit richer and producing more services as well. The one sector that is worth drawing attention to is sort of the kind of vaguely named business services sector, which is you know, a very large market in the UK, very large exporter in the UK, and it is worth flagging that, you know, the UK is on various measures underperforming a lot in India at the moment. So I think our assessment was, you know, we account for about 1.8% of Indian imports of business services, and a number of other markets in the kind of same region, we account for more than 3% of those markets, as we are, you know, one of the largest services exporters. So Indonesia, Singapore, Korea, China even, we account for more than 3%. So there is, you know, high potential there. To deliver that potential, it does mean coming back to those kind of pathways for deeper liberalisation. You know, can it deliver on mutual recognition of professional qualifications and go a bit deeper over time in the deal?
Yeah, that's what I want to ask you a bit further about. This is a specific question, and I want to particularly ask you, you've talked about some of the service sectors. I want to ask you about professional services and what your assessment is, both of you, of provision for professional services, how that's going to happen. I'm going to mention particularly legal services, but that's the declaration I made because that's what I do. You know, I'm a lawyer who provides these services. So, how do you think this liberalisation in professional services how's it going to be achieved, and do you think it will be? So, I don't know. Again, Sophie, you want to say something then, and then Dr. Mattia?
Yeah. So, I mean, the committees that are put into place to deliver kind of ongoing further liberalisation through the agreement. I mean, one of the areas is mutual recognition of professional qualifications in legal services. That is, you know, a quite a big ask, and not something that we've seen a lot of outside of basically the EU, and even there with some restrictions. Whereas, you know, we have seen it in our other agreements for sort of engineers and architects and that kind of professional services sectors instead. So there is possible kind of further liberalisation in those areas if regulators and kind of professional bodies can deliver that over time. But it's not going to be a kind of quick and immediate area where we see a much deeper liberalisation. I wouldn't expect. But yeah, just to come back to my point. Yeah.
You know, I think I'm going to suggest that we go on to the next question, and at some point, if you want to say something, Dr. Mattia, please do.
Lord Hale has a question, I think, that comes in on this issue.
Right. Thank you very much, Chairman. Just following Lord Hane's excellent questions, one of the key ones was how the general geopolitical scene is affecting and has affected this agreement and the outcome and the follow-on. And I'd just like to press a bit further on that, because you do say, or our advisors do say, that these disruptions of the world trade pattern are going on now as a result of President Trump's changes of view. These talks are taking place, and we all know that India has been having a huge development of its energy exchanges with and trades with Russia, and that generally India is trying to, as it were, balance its arrangements between East and West and between the different trading powers of the world in a way that it didn't in the past. This seems to me to be an overridingly significant aspect, and I'd just like a little more reflection from our visitors on how it must be changing the entire scene in the way that it isn't changing now.
Mattia, if you want to kick off on this one.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's going to sort of say something which was roughly in line, I think, with what I was sort of mentioning before. I think the pressures imposed on the system by Trump's tariffs, the 50% tariff imposed on India, and the huge uncertainty that any of the deals that countries have made with the US in recent months still, I mean, there's still, so the uncertainty that there still is around the deals, definitely, I think was a big push for India and the UK to try and finalize a deal that was on the line for about 3 years. Negotiations had been a bit sort of uncertain due to various political issues between countries, and I think this was the right moment to sort of show a political win on both sides. So that's what I think helped precipitating this deal in the last moments.
Sophie, you appear to be nodding in agreement. Do you have anything to add to that response?
No, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think we know India was quite clear that their big kind of ask and their big push was going to be on mobility arrangements. And yes, there was some there was some provisions on that, and there were some kind of prior agreements that moved the dial a little bit on mobility for India into the UK, but not substantially, which maybe does suggest, as Mattia says, that pressure from the US was a contributing factor to them sort of agreeing to this FTA without much deeper commitments on that side.
Perhaps that opens the way for Lord Boateng's question, Paul.
Thank you, Chairman. I mean, a UK-India free trade agreement has been long sought after by successive British governments. It was presented as a sort of holy grail in terms of agreements of this nature. The last government, Lord Marland will remember this very well, singularly failed to achieve any agreement. This government successfully did. So what gave? Is it all down to Trump in terms of the geopolitical pressures, or were they concessions made by either side? And if so, what were they?
Yeah, good question.
Sophie, you can have first go at this one then.
Yeah, I mean, as previously mentioned, the mobility was the big ask for India. I think, it looks like, I'm sure there will be follow-up sessions that go into a lot more detail on, what was delivered in terms of mobility provisions. But it does look like potentially the UK has given up a bit less here than certainly would have been asked. And so that's potentially one area. And on the UK, there were a number of kind of strategic exclusions on the Indian side on tariffs that I'm sure the UK would have pushed for and eventually kind of settled without. But that's pretty par for the course in free trade negotiations. So and similarly, the areas that we've already talked about, maybe having something slightly deeper on services market access. Again, that certainly would have been a UK priority that maybe hasn't delivered to the very furthest point that the UK might have been aiming for. But again, it doesn't look like there were huge trade-offs made at the end on the UK side to get it over the line from my kind of assessment of the deal.
Okay.
Dr. Mattia?
Yes, if I may add, I agree with Sophie. So I think the UK got away with a pretty good deal here. There were concessions made on the tariff side, right? So India lowered its tariff on the sort of main goals for the UK: cars, beverages, and advanced manufacturing. The UK made concession in textile and other sectors that are important for India, such as chemicals and iron and steel. On services, I think the deal got a bit stuck, as Sophie said, and probably because of the UK's inflexibility on visas and the immigration regime. But then there were gains made in terms of access to government procurement in India, which is a significant gain for the UK. It's reciprocal, but this is a first for India.
So that bell indicates another vote, I'm afraid. Can we suspend proceedings and come back? I hope you're both okay for us to come back in about 10 to 15 minutes, 10 minutes or so. So with that, if we suspend this session and we'll come back. Welcome back to this evidence session of the International Agreements Committee, and thank you both our evidence givers for pausing while we went for a vote. So the Noble Lord Marland is next to ask a question.
Well, thank you. And I mean, firstly, let's congratulate the government for getting this over the line. I'm not going to make cheap political points, as have been made before. It's fair to say that neither the civil service or the previous government ever thought this would happen, so congratulations where it's due. The question for you two is, clearly both countries work at a different pace in terms of carbon footprint and climate change significance. To what extent did India seek exemptions from CBAM measures on their exports? And what induced them to reach an agreement without this measure? Is it likely to be an issue for future relationships?
Dr. Ubaldo, if you'd like to start on that one.
Sure. Thank you for the question. So the CBAM is set to launch in 2027 in the UK, right? So this will impose a levy on imports from countries that have lower carbon pricing than the UK in targeted sectors. And yes, the agreement makes no mention of that. So in a way, India didn't get any concession here. And this could undermine the benefits that India will get from the agreement. Now, I think this is also perhaps one of the reasons why the agreement on environment features no binding commitment for India either. Right, the countries basically reaffirmed their support to the objectives of the Paris Agreement, but they mostly made just soft obligations. The one sort of more significant commitment that India made is a so-called non-derogation commitment. So India basically agreed that they will not reduce the domestic level of regulation in environmental areas to attract foreign investment. But then there is no binding dispute settlement to enforce this commitment. So in a way, the agreement is it's really not very ambitious in this area. Not much was achieved. But as I was saying at the beginning, it is the first time that actually India agreed to even put something in an agreement. So it's probably sort of partially a win for the UK.
Thank you.
Sophie, Hale?
I mean, I think that's covered the main points to make. The only thing to flag on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, of course, is, a lot of the countries that India is competing with in terms of importing into the UK will also be affected by the carbon border adjustment mechanism. There may be some exemptions, and countries which are paying for their carbon won't be, but particularly in the sectors where we're expecting to see a big increase in imports from India, the competitors and the countries that we're seeing trade diverting away from to allow that expansion of Indian imports are very likely to be hit with the CBAM as well. So it's not necessarily going to create as much of a relative deterioration for India.
Okay, thank you very much. Baroness Lawler.
Yes, thank you very much. Can I ask you, can you identify any benefits or drawbacks for consumers arising out of this agreement? And I'd particularly like to hear about the benefits or disadvantages for consumers of services trade, because they will have, financial services, for instance, has a big impact on the whole economy, and the implications for the consumers are big. Professional services and particularly legal services have been mentioned, but also digital services. And I'm interested here in data rules, transactions, and the localization of data, which India, I don't think, is moving on, and all kinds of things to do with privacy of data when there are third-party transfers. So perhaps you'd like to comment on that?
Sophie Hale, do you want to go first on
that? So on services, I mean, I'll come back onto data localization, but I guess it's worth flagging that a lot of international trade in services is kind of business to business services exports. So it's whether that be legal services or anything else, it's typically provided from a business in India, say to a UK firm, as opposed to consumers, not in its entirety, but yeah.
Well, wouldn't you say perhaps
one step removed?
On the financial services, a lot will depend on how accessible for consumers, for instance, lending is, mortgage rates, the whole area of how financial services impact consumers. And say with professional services, the availability of lawyers, competition in the legal profession, and so on. We have a 1.9 million or 1.6 million people in this country who own whose origins are in India. Will they move their business to Indian trained lawyers, or so on? That sort of thing, I would say. And perhaps, Dr. Ubaldo, would you like to comment on any of those?
Thank you. Unfortunately, this agreement doesn't go very far in increasing opportunities for the providers of services in these areas. No. We know the finance industry still faces gap in terms of investment in India, and the professional services face the problem of mutual recognition. So the agreement comes a bit short in these areas. So I don't see many benefits for consumers.
So you say that was a give by the UK? We lost on that?
I don't think we lost on that. We locked in our current level of access to India and vice versa, and which is important in itself, considering how uncertain things are. So this is of value, but I don't think the deal goes much further than that. There's other advantages for consumers that come from any liberalization, and you're probably aware of that. Whenever things get cheaper, it's good for consumers, and we have several goods categories where it happens in this deal. We also get cheaper access to Indian inputs in important industries such as chemical, iron, and steel, which will feed into downstream industries, which will also eventually perhaps benefit consumers. But that's where I see most of the benefits for the consumers. I don't see many drawbacks either there. That's
data privacy.
Could you say this again, please?
The rules over data privacy when you transfer data to a third party.
I'm afraid I'm not an expert.
I think we will be coming back to this in a further session, in a different session. So that maybe that you can anticipate that sometime in the future. Are you okay with what you've got? Yeah, thanks.
Very much.
Lord Hale, would you like to ask questions?
Yes, thank you. Behind tactics is strategy, or meant to be, and sometimes strategies in more general conversations in the coffee break and so on. I'd like to ask about the sort of issues that came up both informally and formally as you had your discussions. First, defence. We have had elaborate defence arrangements with India. There was a point not long ago when we were going to sell them a lot of ships, but I don't know whether those orders actually went to Moscow or Beijing instead. But certainly there were some big orders going a few years back. What happened to them? Is it relevant to the provision of critical materials and so on that India is both a civil nuclear power and planning enormous expansion, which presumably we could be involved in, and also a big and existing nuclear power, and therefore a participant in any development of the non-proliferation treaties. These sound distant from trade, but they are trade. They are the big numbers. And this is where we need to know how we're going to be favoured and how our own strategy is going to be strengthened. Two final questions. This is still further back into strategy. Did anyone mention anything about UN reform and our wish, British government's wish, to see India a part of a revised permanent Security Council, which is in the air, but of course we never make any progress because the Russians and Chinese always stop us. But a great many Indian conversations I've had always come back to that point.
Lord Hale, I think maybe, given the time we've got, can we focus in on the industrial military area rather than the entire diplomatic scheme?
They all lie behind each other and all intimately related. So I will certainly, my last question is, you may have noted that the British government, only some of us only just noted, has joined the general abandonment of WTO as being stymied by on the appeal court side, on the appellate court side, and set up a new organisation called, I think, MARA, a multiple interim something, I haven't got the full title here, and sent round a note that there will be 57 other countries, they're going to join in this. Did India have some views on that? A fairly significant step, not much discussed in Britain at the moment, but if you think about it,
okay, well, let's
1945, a very, very dramatic.
As I say, I'm pushing because we have time constraints, so maybe perhaps they can start to tackle your shopping list.
So right.
Mattia, please, if you could start, please.
Thank you. So I'm afraid I'm not an expert on defense and in industrial military area. So this is an area that unfortunately I would rather not provide an answer, and I can't say much about that. If you're happy, I can say something about WTO. I mean, this is it's a period where WTO is under such strain. I think that a deal that is fully WTO compatible with its rules, with the rules of WTO, is definitely very welcome. The UK has recently joined this new arbitration arrangement, or plans to join the new arbitration arrangement in WTO, which is there to replace the lack of an appellate body. India is currently not a member of that. But again, it's unfortunately an area that I don't have much to say about.
Sophie, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm afraid similarly. Sorry, I'm just not an expert on defence at all, so wouldn't have much to add on that area.
Okay, well, I think perhaps we'll take on board those questions and think about future sessions, Lord Hale, in order to tackle some of those questions. Lord German.
We've touched upon the mobility issues earlier, and I wouldn't be, I think just for the record, it might be worth your stating what you think which side has got anything out of this. And I notice that, as far as I can see, that apart from yoga teachers, chefs and classical musicians, there wasn't a great deal of give on the British side. But is there anything that we needed from the Indian side that we didn't get on mobility? And at the same time, there's the other piece, which is the Double Contributions Convention, which we applied. Do you think that's in the benefit of which of the partners? Who will receive more in social security payments? Will we get more, or will the Indians get more?
Sophie, do you want to...
I'm happy to start on that. So on what kind of we have seen on movement of persons, both in the agreement and before, I mean, I guess it's worth flagging the kind of young professional schemes visa, the India Young Professional Scheme visa. That wasn't part of the FTA, but it was launched kind of in the process of negotiating the FTA. The business visa, I mean, as you alluded to, in terms of the expansion, it was quite small and limited to 1,800 people a year, quite specific professions. But it did also lock in some access and, gave some kind of future predictability to Indian business visitors into the UK, and likewise it was kind of locking in the access that the UK can have moving over to India. I think where probably more was achieved from the Indian side was the Double Contributions Convention. To your question, who would gain more? I mean, net migration from India is pretty large into the UK, so from that perspective, they will be more likely to be there will be more people not paying the national insurance contributions in the UK, like probably than the other way around. But the extent to which, how the values compare obviously depends on how large those contributions are as well.
Thanks, Mattia.
Yeah, if I may add to that, I think the DCC is a win for the UK, given the very deep request that India had in terms of visa so access to UK. There are costs, as Sophie mentioned. There are benefits too, right? The DCC reduces employment costs on both sides, might generate more activity, and we hope the net effect might actually end up being positive. It's actually also probably worth saying that this is an arrangement that already existed. It was just up to a year, and now it's been extended up to 3 years. And it's actually of shorter duration than similar arrangements that the UK has with other countries. So on the whole, I don't think this will affect migration patterns significantly, especially not in the long term, also because all these temporary workers will still need to get a visa, subject to various requirements. So these workers won't undercut these workers. It's a simple arrangement that will help basically not interrupting contribution records on both sides if these workers are still employed by their firms based in their home countries. If they get employment abroad, this will not apply. So I think it's actually something the UK got away from with a deal with in a positive line.
Lord Chairman, does that fill your...
Yeah, that's fine, thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, final question, I think, is Lord Stevenson.
Thank you. We've actually covered, I think, most of the ground that was in my schedule of questions. So I wondered if I could just focus a little bit on procedural issues and finish up on that. A lot of what we've been talking about and what's in the document is quite dependent on a number of committees, or a large number of committees that are set up. I wondered if that was a common feature of FTAs and whether we'll see that as being a mechanism for going forward. But if they do work, presumably there's going to be quite a volume of material coming forward in future years. And I think the government is giving an agreement that this will be done under CRAG. Can you see that working in practice? And if so, could you give us a headline of where you think the developments that we'll be seeing in the future will come from?
Dr. Mattia.
Well, I agree that a lot of what has been written in this FTA defers action to the future. There's lots of provisions on cooperation, technical cooperation that will create work going forward, or future negotiation altogether. So I think this is fairly typical in agreements of the size of this company, such comprehensive FTAs. I think from a procedural point of view, this is pretty standard. But yes, a lot of what's in the FTA has, basically created more work for the future.
And Sophie.
Yeah, I guess I think the only thing to add is that, the trade strategy pretty much set out that post kind of the India FTA, this is where a lot of the focus of the department's energy will be going into delivering these kind of mutual recognition arrangements or using these committees that already exist under the free trade agreements that the UK has signed to kind of progress liberalisation with our largest trading partners. And I guess maybe that's a bit of a symptom of the fact there isn't, a lot of market access left on the table in terms of seeking new free trade agreements. But it's also about, making sure that we're targeting the areas that are important to the UK. So services where it does take that kind of slower sort of post, you need those institutions, you need those arrangements in order to deliver that kind of later liberalisation. And we have seen the UK delivering on that with, in certain sectors, whether that could be kind of some of those MRPQs that we have seen with countries like Canada and New Zealand. So India might be a bit of a trickier negotiation, but it's good to see them kind of focusing on that. And the other thing that's in the trade strategy, which was encouraging, is some funding for regulators to kind of pursue these conversations, because obviously it's just like a kind of extra task, and having a lot of these committees across a number of agreements is very time consuming. So to get to kind of the depth that you need to deliver something meaningful in terms of liberalisation, you do need the resource available. So it was positive to see that reflected in the trade strategy as well.
Thank you, that's very interesting.
Okay, well, I think that draws us to the end of the questions we have, and I'd like to thank our two experts for a really comprehensive and thorough response on the first of, as I say, the first of 6 sessions that we have. So thank you both for your help, and I think we will now go off air, and if you can let me know when we have gone off air.